Welcome to the Noon at Northside podcast with your host, Pastor Stephanie. Hi everyone and welcome. So I am your host, Pastor Stephanie, and for this first week, I kind of wanted to give a short introduction into what this podcast is going to be. Bear with me here because this is my first time doing a podcast, so I'm really hoping that I can do it justice and make it something that you're really interested in listening to. For those of you who are listening to this podcast, Noon at Northside is a podcast about bridging the gap between the church now. What we're talking about is we're about bridging the gap between people's perspectives. As someone who represents the young adult community, the young adult perspective, we're noticing, a bit of a gap between people my age. There's a huge gap between the people who are older than me and the people who are younger than me in the church. And my generation, my perspective tends to get a little lost. So this podcast is mostly about just kind of filling in that gap, learning to understand topics from all sorts of perspectives, both the younger perspective and the older perspective, to see, the differences that we have and where we can learn from each other. That's sort of the whole goal between this podcast. And it's also just about giving you something that you can listen to whenever you have the opportunity to listen. Sometimes it can get a little hard to, manage our schedules when we have to try to work around when to come into the church for discipleship classes, when we have the time to sit down and watch a video on Facebook. It can get a little much sometimes. So just having a podcast, something to listen to, maybe when we're working out, maybe when we're driving in the car, maybe when we're just sitting around and we've got nothing else to do, just seems like, to me, a really good way to get to listen to other people's perspectives. Plus, podcasts are a great way to kind of bridge the gap to the younger generations. It's something we're really into, and it's something I think that can help bring us all together. So for those of you who probably saw the title of this podcast and thought, what does this mean? You have every right to think that. This podcast title was something, we came up with here at Elkhart Northside Church of the Nazarene to kind of, help us not only stand out as a podcast, but also kind of use some play on words. So if you looked at the title of our podcast, it kind of looks like none at Northside, which seems a little weird. But that word none, N-U-N, is actually a Greek word used in the Bible. And it's sort of like our theme word when we talk about this podcast. The reason for that is it's a word that is found throughout the Bible, but it's in our main theme verse. So for this podcast, our main verse is Hebrews 8:6. So that's Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. And I'm taking it from the New Living Translation, or the NLT. And that says, "But now Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood, for he is the one who mediates for us a far better covenant with God, based on better promises." That is our theme verse because it is about bridging gaps. It is a verse that tells us that Jesus has come to mediate between the old covenant and the new covenant, to not just rewrite, what is old, but to bring about new meaning to it, new life to it, to bring about, the fulfillment of God's promises by saying, the things that you had to do in the past aren't necessary today because Christ has come. Because he has come, he has made the sacrifice that was needed, the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. And now the covenant has new meaning and it has new value to it. And he has come to mediate between the two, the old and the new, and to kind of talk about how when we are going into the future, we are going into this new covenant, and this covenant that we are into has to line up now with the world we're living in, with the Christ who has come, who has changed the perspective of the covenant with God. It is based on better promises, and it is a better covenant, this one that Jesus comes with and that he brings to us. Now, when I say this, I don't want anyone to get confused and think that I mean that new is always better, because that's not always the case. Sometimes new can be weird, and sometimes, why change the old because it's already great. But the reason I want to, kind of talk about this perspective change and use this as our theme verse is because just because there's a gap between the old and the new doesn't mean that there isn't some way to connect the two. In this verse, when we're talking about the old covenant and the new covenant, the one that's holding them together is Christ. He's a bridge between the two. Tying them together, not pushing them apart. He's not coming to throw out the old covenant completely. He's come to bring it new life, to bring it new meaning, to offer it a new perspective. And that's kind of what I think is the case when it comes to the young adult perspective. Yes, it's new. Yes, it's different. Yes, it's not exactly the same as the old perspective because we live in a different world. People my age have grown up in a very, very different world than people like my parents or people like my grandparents. The world has changed, and yes, we're not to change with the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our perspectives are the same either. Our perspectives have to adapt to, fit the world in a way that it can reach the world. Sometimes the old perspectives aren't capable of reaching the world today because the world is so different. But if our values remain the same, if the covenant we believe in that Christ has brought is the same, then everything should fit together beautifully. We should still be able to reach the world, to fulfill our calling, without compromising who we are, what we believe in, even if that means learning from a new perspective. And that goes the same for people my age. If you're a young adult listening to this, our perspective is definitely not always right. It could be completely wrong. I don't know. But there is something to learn from us, just as there's something to learn from those older than us. There's a reason why we're supposed to have older mentors in our life. Because, we haven't experienced life enough or as much as they have. They have value to offer us. They have wisdom to offer us. And our perspective could use that wisdom to better the world, to better our lives. And so there's something to learn from both, young adult perspective and the older perspective. So, getting back to the title of this podcast, the word noon here in this verse is the word now. When it started at the very beginning, but now Jesus. Noon is the Greek word meaning now. It is pronounced noon, but it means now. It means at the present. And the reason why this stood out to me so much as the focus for this podcast is because when we're talking about now, we can't look at the message of Jesus as it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or even just 10 years ago, because it could be very different than what the message needs to be now. As the world changes, God's message adapts because its focus needs to be on what is important today, what God needs us to say today. And so if we're focusing on the perspectives of today, of the present time, then I think we're going to be able to learn so much more from each other. We're going to be able to address the issues of today if we're focusing on today's perspectives, today's problems. So to me, focusing on the word now really helps us cover this bridge to, actually bridge the gap that we're trying to cover. It's also a fun play on words because it's pronounced noon, even though it looks like none. And I thought it was funny that we're going to be dropping episodes for this podcast at noon on Fridays. So, it was supposed to be kind of funny, kind of play on words. There is also another play on words here that I really wanted to cover. And that is, the word that is in our title spelled like the word none. And it kind of gets you thinking about, or at least people like, ministry people who have witnessed this, have studied this. There is this phenomenon going on in the world right now called the nuns. Not N-U-N like, the nuns we're thinking of, but the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. These are the people who, asked in surveys, always answer that they have no religious affiliation of any kind. They write down none at the bottom of surveys. And this number is constantly growing in the world today. It was never as big as it is right now. And in all honesty, we're noticing that this has a lot to do with the fact that certain perspectives in the church, certain things that we talk about, that we value, tend to alienate certain people in the world. And they experience this, whether they've gone to church or not. They've experienced the way the church, turns their back on some people and think that's not something I really want to be a part of. No, they're not necessarily going to a different, religion. They're not going to a different denomination. They're not even just giving up on, Christ at all. They just don't want to be a part of the organization, of the institution of the church that we've built, because there are some things in the capital C church, the universal church, that we need to change, because we're fighting against ourselves. We're fighting against our own perspectives. We're stuck in perhaps an older way of thinking and not focusing on what is happening right now. And that can tend to alienate people. So, when we talk about bridging the gap, I also want in the back of our minds to be thinking about these nuns that we're really trying to reach. And a lot of them are people my age. A lot of them are young adults who want to believe in God, want to believe in Christ, want to believe in the church, but don't want to stand up with some of the older ways that the church focuses on, some of the not so great, beliefs that the church has. Whether they're right beliefs or even if they're wrong beliefs, they don't want to associate with some of them. And they are, when we talk about them here in the church, they are controversial topics. They are ones that we might talk about here and you might not want to listen to, which is fine. Everyone is entitled to listen or not listen to something. But I want that to be in the back of our mind, as in we're really trying to bridge the gap. And so that means we're going to get down, we're going to get dirty. That means we might be talking about some controversial topics, some things that, you might be listening to this and you might not agree with my perspective, or you might not agree with our guest speakers' perspectives. Or you might want to comment on something and perhaps I don't agree with it, which is perfectly fine. We don't necessarily have to 100% agree with each other to listen to each other, to understand each other's point of views, each other's perspectives. The point of all of this isn't to completely 180 what we've always known. It's simply to be open to the fact that maybe there's another way to look at this, to be open to saying, well, maybe I had it wrong, or maybe they have it wrong. I don't know. That's why, in this podcast, we're going to be listening to several different people's perspectives. Yes, Pastor Stephanie, I am your host, and every first week of the month that we do this, because we're going to be doing this podcast every other week, so there's going to be basically 2, maybe 3 podcasts a month. I'm going to be doing the first one. I'm going to be introducing the topic to you. I'm going to be giving you my perspective. I'm going to be giving you the sort of young adult perspective. But I'm also going to be having the next week that we do a podcast 2 weeks later is going to be someone else's perspective. It could be someone younger than me. It could be someone older than me. It could be a male perspective versus my female perspective. It could be a different female perspective. It could be whatever. Because I want us, when we're bridging this gap here, to listen to different people's perspectives, to hear the same thing from different people, or different sides of the same thing from different people. That's sort of the whole goal to this podcast. Well, if you are still listening, I know this podcast was basically just an introduction. We're going to get down to the first real topic, the first real episode next week, August 13th. And, we'll be talking about what that podcast is, leading up to next week. You can find information about this podcast on our own Facebook page or at Elkhart Northside's Facebook page. If you want to follow our podcast page on Facebook, you can follow us. Our page is hashtag Noon at Northside, which is hashtag NUNATNORTHSIDE. That is all one word, hashtag Noon at Northside. You can follow our page, you can like our page, and you can find each episode being posted there. You can also get word about what our topics are going to be on Elkhart Northside Church of the Nazarenes page. If you follow that, awesome. You'll get notifications for that. If you don't yet follow that, go ahead and follow both of our pages. We'd love to have you kind of interacting with our church. You can also download Elkhart Northside's app that we have, which if you go into the App Store, it's Northside Elkhart. And you can download our app not only to, stay in touch with what our church is doing, our sermons on Sundays, whatever it is we've got going on, but I will also be uploading every episode into our app if that is more easily convenient for you to listen to, that you can go into our app, can listen to each podcast, and they will always be there for you to go back to listen to or to keep listening here. So just to recap some things about this podcast for those of you who kind of forgot a few things. If you want to know, our theme verse is always going to be centered around Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6, focusing in the NLT version. We're going to be dropping episodes every other Friday at 12 p.m. noon, where I will be hosting one week and having a guest speaker the other week. Feel free, like I said, to follow our page, hashtag Noon at Northside. Also, feel free on any podcast, on anything where you see our podcast information on, to drop comments. You can, drop a comment on your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, whatever you want. But also feel free to drop suggestions for topics. I'm going to be picking topics for every month, mostly based on things that I hear around me, but also things that people have commented on past episodes, past podcasts, things that you say you're interested in hearing or interested in talking about. If you want to be a guest speaker, let me know. If you want a specific topic, let me know that too, so that we can cover a wide variety of topics, helping us bridge that gap. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. So feel free to, like I said, follow our page, but I will catch you guys next week, August 13th, when we start our official first episode podcast of the podcast here at Northside, Noon at Northside. I'm your host, Pastor Stephanie, and I will see you guys next week.